We're kind of figuring it out as we go. So this is the agenda for today. A lot of items to cover in about 40 minutes. And so we're going to break it up. And you've got the slides that you can reach through your jump drive or also from the website. And so who are new trustees? Oh, good. And returning trustees? And administrators. All right. So administrators, you're going to hear this all over again. I think you probably have already heard it. But I'm going to start, Betty's going to start going over the sources of operating revenue. We also have a handout in the back of the room, and if you don't have one of these, I'll bring it around to you. So as Betty gets going, that's what we'll do. You can use this mic if you'd be...
It seems like going behind you.
Yes.
We'll get this straight eventually here, how we're going to do this. Again, thank you for being here. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you. Most of you understand this, but for those of you who don't, we actually have what we call the three-leg stool approach, and that is that we get state appropriations from for our core operations, instruction, and student services. Let me move this. There we go. And property taxes, we all have that opportunity as well for our maintenance and operations, and then we receive tuition and fees. And those are the basic funding sources, revenue stream that we have as a community college. This is an interesting chart because it actually shows you what's been happening over a period of time to community colleges. And what you can see, I think that's really important, is that black line is the enrollment and how that's been increasing for community colleges over the years. Most of us understand that. I mean, that's doubled, more than doubled over these past years. We're looking at 2006 to 2016. The numbers for 2018 are pretty close. They track. But what you can also see, look at that blue line that's there. That's state appropriations. And you can see that at one time, and I actually remember those times when we got 66%. Most of us weren't around in this room, but I do. And then we've dropped now to 24, and I think it's even less on the newer figures for 2018. So you can see that's happening. And then in relation to that, what's happening otherwise to our students and our property taxes are that student tuition and fees are increasing because we have to make up those differences to provide a quality instructional program. And at the same time, in some areas, the taxes have been going up as well. So that's kind of what's happened to us because of what's been going on with state appropriations. And if you look at a comparison for community colleges, we've got San Jac, Wharton, Clarendon, Tarrant, and then statewide on there. And you can see that each community college is just a little bit different. Look at San Jacinto. The taxes there, they're about 38%, but if you look at Wharton, we're 16%. That's because we have a very small tax base in Wharton. We only have Wharton County and Meadville Independent School District, but we have a 4,000 square mile service area. So we're serving a lot of students with a little tax base. And so that makes our student tuition and fees much higher for us to continue. And you look at Clarendon, it's even more so. If you look at, it's 56% there, so it's very close to us. And then Tarrant has a lot larger tax base, so they're 64%. So that's the variations. You're going to find your community colleges is slightly different as well, depending on the tax base, the service area. It makes a big difference. And if you look statewide, how that compares as well. So tuition and fees are about 38% statewide. And those have been increasing. And unfortunately, you know that our role is to provide quality, but it's also to provide access. And so at the same time we're pricing that tuition and fee higher, we're probably not helping those students that we need to serve the most. This is just looking a little bit at tuition and fees overall. Most of us have tried to keep our tuition fees low for our in-district. That's our taxpayers. In-district means that you're within our tax districts. So for those that are out of our tax districts, to make up the difference, we've had to increase those. And you can see that line as well as and then the non-resident are the out-of-state. But overall, you can see it hasn't increased that greatly. We're really trying to keep that low. But the partnership with the state has shifted, so that makes it even more difficult as we move forward. Property taxes are another interesting look. And if you look at the valuation of property taxes, that's where your big difference has occurred, is the valuation. It's not the rate that community colleges are actually charging. It's that valuation that's been going up. And if you look at that, then property valuation in community college, we're 70% of the state's property wealth. And the value of property wealth in college districts has more than doubled since 2006. That's something we have no control over as community colleges. The valuation is set outside of our area. So we have no say in that, and taxpayers don't often understand that because they see their taxes going up on their property, and they will call you and say, why are you increasing my taxes? And actually, we have decreased the rate for that period of time. But explaining that to them is difficult, and then they figure out what's happening to them, and then they complain about that to the whole state. But it is that valuation that's continuing to go up, and you're going to hear a lot more about that in the session because it's pricing some people out of owning a home. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague now.
So the state budgeting process is really important for community colleges, and you're going to have a role in that as a trustee. And so if you look, these are the big components of the state budgeting revenues. The state has about $110 billion, more or less, for the biennium. About 87% of that comes from sale and other taxes. And we're waiting for the comptroller to come out with what those reports are, and so that, because it really sets the dynamics for the session. So the budgeting process for community colleges, I call it a partnership, and we really are trying to work as a partnership. So there's 50 community colleges in Texas. We work together as the Texas Association of Community Colleges, and you also see CAT up there. CAT is the Community College Association of Texas Trustees, not CCAT, it's CAT. And I'm sorry, I get corrected a lot, so I thought I'd do that. So, and that represents the trustees. So we start out in our process with TACC working through legislative priorities, CAT's working through legislative priorities. Our two legislative committees come together and make sure that we're getting priorities aligned. And then we go through the LAR process, the legislative appropriation request. The 50 community colleges have alignment around that request. We go as the 50 of us together with a legislative proposal. And so as we're working through that agenda, TACC puts together instructions that your CFO and your CEO are submitting that legislative appropriation request together. And then in September, we had a hearing. Again, community colleges is one unit. Presented that to the Legislative Budget Board. And then that becomes what has been submitted. That'll go into the budget process. The real pieces around this are that CAT and TACC are working very clearly together. Now, there are some community colleges that may have a special request that they put in for funding. TACC doesn't support that, but they also don't come out against it. Again, we are really focused on how do we fund the 50 community colleges. This again shows the partnership, TACC and CAT, and it also talks about the coordinating board. So we are involved with the coordinating board. They have a formula advisory committee. They have a community college and technical college leadership council that our trustees have, some trustees are involved with. But again, we're trying to align that. And one of the other things we should have on this slide is we work with the Texas Community College Association of Teachers, TACC. And so that, again, is important that there's alignment. As we move into the session, what happens is the Legislative Budget Board has gotten all these LARs, and then the House and the Senate present their budget bills. This year, the House will take the lead on the budget, and that gets introduced. And through the process, if it was just 3 boxes like this, it would be great, but it's, you have the House version, you have the Senate version, and then in the end, there's a conference committee. And we are actively involved. And I want to say, again, it's important for the trustees to be engaged around this process. When we're testifying, we may have a president, but then we also try to have somebody from CAT testifying, a trustee, because you're elected, you're speaking to elected officials, and you can put the case out better than a hired person like myself. So, state funding for community colleges. Our model's changed. So state funding, you can see there was a point where we were funded on full-time student equivalent, then we went to just funding around contact hours. In 2014, we went to a new model with core operations, dollars per success point, and then dollars per contact hour. And so this is the model we're funded under now, and even that has evolved. So from the last session, this is the breakdown. There was about 4% that was around core operations, 10% for student success points, and then contact hours was the rest. You're going to get, as Betty will talk about, the different components and what that means to institutions. And then this is what happened out of the last session. Student success points took a greater, got additional funding, so it represented 12%, but core operations got additional funding also, so each institution got more. And so that's where the model is at this present time. I know you can't read it, but you've got the handout. Do all of you have the blue sheet? If not, let me get some more. Miles, you should have it memorized, so. Sorry, you're in the front row, so I can have it. Here you go. Thank you. But I think most people have it. If not, there's some in the back of the room. Raise your hand. They're going to hand them out, and then I can hand out more. But this represents our 3 top priorities for this legislative session. And it is funding. It is to invest in community colleges, invest in our students. The second item is around dual credit, broadening access and sustaining the quality. And then the third item is workforce, because the workforce training that we do is critical to the state. And so you can see at the bottom of that form is the TACC logo, the CAT logo, and the TACTA logo. And again, there's clear alignment around the funding priorities. This, you can't read either, but let me tell you what it's saying. It's saying that in the last legislative session, we had almost $1.8 billion between the 50 community colleges. You can see the core operations, the contact hours, the student success points. You also see Bachelor of Applied Technology. There are, I think, 5 community colleges that are offering bachelor programs out of that last session, so they were getting a separate line item of funding. That'll increase this next session because the availability of bachelor programs for community colleges has opened up a little bit. Austin has gotten approved. I think Grayson has gotten approved. San Jac will be applying over the next few months, so you'll see that change also. But the other columns, why they're important, is the Formula Advisory Committee is a committee made up of CEOs working with the coordinating board around what are the funding priorities for the session. They're meeting right after the last session ends. Then you also, and they made a recommendation of the different categories. Then the coordinating board, their recommendation goes to the coordinating board. Coordinating board approved that recommendation, and so that's at $1.9 billion. And then the yellow column is TACC and CAT. Our recommendation aligns with the coordinating board. That's important going into this session. And the reason that's important, last session we didn't align. The coordinating board made their recommendation. It was more than ours. As we started getting into the session early, our preparation, it became clear that our legislators were saying, you need to be reasonable. And so we revised our ask last session before we went in, so there was a gap. Going into this session, we're all aligned. And so you can see the increases with the majority coming into contact hours and then the other piece coming into student success points. So Betty's going to talk to you about the core operations funding and the contact hour funding, what those mean, and then I'll tell you about the student success points.
Thank you, Brenda. Core operations used to be what we would call a small college or allotment. And that formula was about as complicated as you can get and still did not really help fund some of the smaller colleges. So core operations is an amount that each college receives, regardless of their size. Of course, for the larger colleges, it's not that significant, but for a mid-sized or small college, it really goes to help pay for those operations that everyone has, that they have to fund. You're going to have certain operations regardless of your size. So that's the whole purpose of that. And when we started this, it was $500,000 per year for each community college. That was in the fiscal year 2014, 2015. And during the last session, that was up to $680,406 for each community college for each year. Now, in our current plan, we're not asking for an increase in that, but it is still there. And it's really there to help and support. So each community college has a set amount. That also helps them to know that. You know, the funding, as Brenda explained, we sometimes don't know what our funding is going to be till the very last minute. So this helps stabilize us a bit. Now, contact hour formula funding has been with us forever that I can remember. Actually didn't start until about 1974, I believe. And but then it went to contact hour formula funding. It's the time a student spends in their instructional classroom, basically. And this is, I think, a pretty good explanation of that. We're looking at a government course, 3 credit hours, and it meets 1.5 hours each Tuesday, and it meets for 16 weeks, and you get 48 contact hours for that per student. And for a class of an average of 20 students, then that explains you get 960 contact hours. And that's the largest portion of our funding. It was about 86%. Continues to be based on the number of contact hours generated. So when you hear, if you're an administrator, you totally understand this, but as a board member, enrollment is still critical to community colleges. We're moving in a little bit of a different direction on the student success points, but it is still critical to us to have those students in that classroom. And a large percentage of our cost goes at the very first of a class. Yes, ma'am.
So is that as of the 12th class day, or how?
Yes, ma'am. It is as of, in a regular semester, 16 week, it would be the 12th.
12th class day, and it's for what categories of instruction?
Okay, I was going to explain it. There is a formula that is looked at, and they're not all funded at the same rate. So if you have a high cost program, you're going to get more per contact hour for that. But in general, there's a general number, and let me go to the next one and I'll show you that. So it's distributed based, that's how it's distributed. The state comes up with an amount that they're going to fund. And then for each community college, you go back and look at their contact hours, and then it's appropriated based upon that. But a class that costs the institution more is funded at a higher rate. So they're not all the same, but the average is $2.70. But we used to say $3, but now it's about $2.70. And we're requesting $2.75. Did that help answer your question, Mary?
Partly is the distinction between academic.
There is a distinction. One is a higher cost So the formula funding rate is a bit higher, but if you look at the average is what we're looking at for all. Because, you know, an academic class that's, let's just take math or something that doesn't have a lot of overhead and cost other than the instructional cost itself is at a less amount.
And we send in every year our fundable operating costs broken down by program. So that's how they know how the allocation is. So each college by the different categories sends that in.
Right. You know, if you've got, the one that used to be the highest was we used to actually have a pilot program, that is flying program. And that was one of the highest cost rates. And so you just take those and go through those and then come up for the state with the median cost. And that's what's requested. But then there's a certain amount then that it goes out for appropriations from, yes ma'am.
How do internet courses affect this? Since a lot of schools now are going to internet-based teaching.
They're still, if they're within that category, they're still funded at that rate. So it doesn't, the delivery in most cases is not the question. It may enter into the cost of all that whole program if there's a cost for that, but overall it's the same funding rate. So if you offer English, whether you offer it through the internet or whether you offer it in a classroom, it's going to be funded at the same rate for that particular area. This just gives you a little more information as well on how that occurs. And the base year is important, and we're always getting base years confused. I've been doing this for a long time. Actually used to do it for the state, but every now and then we change the base year. We're still in base year right now. It started in March, actually, of the previous year, and will end in the spring. And we usually do estimates for the state, and then we actually turn in the actuals after that. So it's always in the rears. We always get our funding based upon what has already occurred, and we get it for 2 years. And then if you're growing in that particular area, you have to live with what you received. So it's always behind, and that's been the case since the inception of this particular methodology. And if you look at the formula funding, this is in billions. I can remember when we hit $1 billion, and then we became important. Until we hit $1 billion, we were not really important as far as standing out to the state, but when you do that. And so if you look at the, it's still, you know, the largest portion, but we have moved now to the outcomes portion where we have student success points, and we actually recognized the need to do that, community colleges did, and moved forward on that ourselves and asked to be funded based upon our actual output of students and their completion. And Brenda's going to go over that in a lot more detail in a minute, but you can see that we're still almost at the same as we were not moving very quickly as far as actually getting more in the formula funding, which is critical to our institutions. And you've seen earlier we've talked about the state reduction in funding and who's paying for that, and actually you as citizens are paying for both. I mean, your community colleges receive local tax monies, but it's also, everything comes from taxes in one way or the other. So we're not moving totally in the total amount, but we have actually added the outcomes, student success points. Now, Brenda's going to discuss this because she chaired the committee that came up with this. I was on it, but Brenda does an excellent job. So, yeah, just blame Brenda, whatever you do.
So,
I'm sorry.
It's really not me. What ended up happening, how we got into this, was there was really a lot of discussion at the legislature that they wanted to move to performance-based funding. And there was a talk at one point that should be 25% of our funding model. And we were nervous. I mean, we didn't want somebody else to design that for us. And so we got active as community colleges and designed it. And we based it on research from models like in Washington that had already put momentum points into place. And so we had a task force that consisted of presidents It had institutional research people, registrars, CFOs, really trying to understand. And we spent a lot of time designing it. So it was designed to reward colleges for improvement on student achievement. And we've always been colleges focused on student achievement. I can tell you, every one of your institutions, your faculty, your staff, and administrators are focused on this, and they always have been. This just was a way to really demonstrate what we were doing in all the different areas and try to also reward us for that work. The system was based on achievement and progress. You'll see a diagram it'll show you. It takes across our entire continuum of the work we do. And it was also designed to be more of a predictable model. And I'll tell you a little bit about that also. And so we started working on it in 2010, and then it was implemented in 2014. This is the model, and you can see it starts with developmental education. As we get students through developmental education, we get points. As they are going through college level reading and writing and then math, there's points, 15 credit hours, 30 credit hours, and then ultimately getting a certificate, an associate degree, or a transfer right here. And there are some STEM areas where it's weighted higher for a degree, 2.25. There are areas where there aren't any lines coming down. When we designed it, we knew that the data that was being captured wasn't good, and we didn't want to put points in place where data wasn't being captured for all the colleges. And so we know GED is important work that we do, but again, there's a lot more need out there, and is that data really being captured? And the model has changed a lot. This high demand workforce and employment area, our vision had been that this would become more of a regional need based on what the region needs, and we would build some components in it. The metrics committee met again this past session. They met with the coordinating board, and we have some ideas, or that committee has some ideas about where this could develop in the future, but we weren't ready to move forward with any additional recommendations. And as we were putting this together, we made sure all the way the data was being captured was tied back to our systems and how we were reporting to the coordinating board. So the other piece of it really became funding. As we went into the model, that first year we were funded at $185 a point. It was a rolling 3-year average. So let's say it took 14, 13, and year 12 all rolled together, and we averaged that. We wanted to make sure we didn't have blips in the data. With enrollment, we have some highs, we have some lows. We felt this 3-year rolling average would help us. And it was a comparison of my institution from one year to the next. And that was what we wanted. We wanted it to be competing among ourselves. The next session, the funding went down to $173 a point. And you can see in both of those cases that we tied it to 10% of formula funding. We took out the core operations. Whatever was left, 10% was for student success points. I think that actually hurt us that session. And so this last session, the 85th, we asked that there not be a 10% split. But the funding went down again. Sorry, let me be positive. And the funding went down again. And so for this session, we have worked closely with the coordinating board, and we are asking for $215 a point. If you really look at that, that's inflation. And you don't get incentive if that's what this was designed to do with declining funding. And so that's the recommendation, and we're hopeful for this. This is how student success points have performed throughout the state. There has been significant increase over the period. There has been, you can see those kinds of increases for all community colleges. For my institution, if I go back to that 83rd session, we had generated around 41,000 in student success points. This last session, we were at about 52,500. And so that when you start multiplying that out, it was about $4.7 million a year for student success points. This is important because student success points this last session went up 7%, and contact hours went down 0.7%. As we were designing the model, we were hoping we would take away some of that fluctuation that we have with enrollment. And so I think we accomplished that. So with this 7% student success point increase, out of the 50 community colleges, 43 had increases and 7 had declines in that year. On the contact hours, out of 50 community colleges, 23 had declines in contact hours. So I think it helps to offset. There's still debate about that. Is there a point where that's not going to continue? I don't know. But I think it's something we've got to continue to work on together. For this next session, student success points, we're estimating a 4% increase, and base year contact hours, we're estimating a 1% increase. And so those increases have gone into those calculations we showed you for the funding request of $1.9 billion. We'll adjust those as we get through this base year funding period. And in the end, as your institution, you need to look at how core operations, contact hours, and student success points impact you. Core operations is very small to me. As Betty mentioned, it was originally $500,000 a year. It's up to $680,000. That's really not a lot of money in, I don't want to lose it, just in case you're taking notes, but it's not big in comparison to my contact hours and my student success points. On the other side of it, Clarendon, that $680,000 is significant. And so you need to make sure how that allocation works. As we were putting together the legislative agenda, we felt we had stabilized core funding last time. That's why we've made student success points the priority funding item for this year. Now, next session, after we're funded at $215 a point, that may change. We may take a different look. But we've got to make sure we're looking at all 50 community colleges and the impact. So Betty's going to talk about group health insurance and retirement, which is another big item for us.
This used to be one of the most contentious issues during a legislative session. Many of us in this room have gone through this. It was called proportionality. And we would contend that that made absolutely no sense to us, because the more that you funded locally, the more of that proportion became your responsibility. And so the state was saying, well, we only pay 18% of the instructional costs, so we ought to only be funding 18% of those eligible employees for group health. And not all of your employees are eligible. Your fiscal plan employees are not eligible for this. So that came, I guess, to a head, you might say, at one point in time. And several of us were asked to sit with the Senate Finance Committee and discuss this whole issue. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever sat across from a number of senators who are on the Senate Finance Committee, and that's usually a lot of your senior members, and they walk in and say, we're only giving you 18%, take it or leave it. And so we had a long discussion, and I'm looking at Miles because he was sitting in there as well. And we finally came up with the sharing, which is a 50% for the community colleges and 50% for the state. And that is in statute, so we do get that. Thank you very much. And some of us thought, well, that, I'm not sure that's great. But then, as one escalated, and health insurance costs have escalated, in the last session we received 15% increase in that allocation. So it is set. We don't have to worry about it each time. And that, to me, is one of the more important things. And also, as the cost goes up, so does the state's cost. So it's not like they're going to say, no, we can't afford that. This is not one that we even have to put in our plan anymore. So I feel good about that, at what's happened for the community colleges. The other is the retirement benefits. And community college employees must participate in either the teacher retirement system or the optional retirement system program. And TRS is a defined benefit plan, and ORP is a contribution plan. So most of our faculty in my institution belong to TRS. At one point in time, TRS interest rates were not so good, so people went into ORP that had the option. It's $122 million was appropriated by the legislature for community college retirement benefit, and that's 7% increase from the previous biennium. And you know, retirement is a big issue right now on the plate for the state, solidifying and making sure that that's a stable thing for the state of Texas. So that will continue to be discussed. But we are fortunate to receive those benefits for our employees, regardless of how it goes up or down, because so many people in private industry are paying huge amounts for health insurance, and a lot of them don't even have retirement systems. So I think we've benefited. We've had to fight hard to keep these for our employees. And of course, TRS, the question is, the long term for TRS right now, and ORP will go, you contribute that yourself. So I think we're at a point where we've been given the high sign from the back that we need to conclude and allow you to ask some questions if you have any, and Brenda and I will attempt to answer those. Yeah, no.
I do have a question on the health benefits for retirees. Is that under TRS or ERS?
ERS.
ERS for retirees,
ERS,
for health insurance.
yes, for health insurance. I
So
understand
does that mean that, and I'm not aware of this, my wife is a retired state employee, and I'm a TRS, a retired TRS, so there's a difference there. Are the health insurance benefits covered 100% then for under ERS?
You know, because I'm
Because I
not.
know with state employees it is, but not with.
I don't think it is.
I don't think so, but I don't know the actual answer to that percentage.
Yeah, active employees are 100%, but
Yeah.
I don't know about retired.
Yeah, that's statutorily required that active employees are 100% for the employee. But I'm not certain on the other. This, depend.
It's not,
No, not on our case, and we're on medium size, but out of pocket, our bill is $660,000 a year for our retirement insurance. And just FYI, if you have a branch employee and they
You have to
retire
have
from your institution, you pay their insurance.
That's true, yeah, for retired.
Out of pocket for everyone.
But I'm not sure of the percentages. We can get you that information to the president.
Any other questions? So I know the slides were hard to read in some cases, but they're on that jump drive. If you have any questions, we'll be around for the next session.
Thank you all for your attention. We greatly appreciate it.